The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 1. The Strange Man's Arrival. The stranger arrived on an early wintry February day. He trudged through the snow carrying a small black bag in his gloved hand. The journey from the Bramblehurst railway station to the Coach and Horses Inn in southern England was a long one. Although he was wrapped up from head to foot, the cold air stung his body. His long black coat and thick gloves did little to protect him from the biting wind. The brim of his hat hid every inch of his face except the shiny tip of his nose. The snow fell heavily as he staggered into the inn. He appeared more dead than alive as he flung his bag onto the ground. "A fire!" he cried. "In the name of mercy, a room and a fire!" He stamped and shook the snow off himself. The innkeeper, Mrs. Hall, greeted him at the bar. After he threw some money at the woman, she showed him to a room upstairs. Mrs. Hall lit a fire for him in his room. Then she left him alone while she went to prepare him a meal. A guest found himself in Epping in the dead of winter was a piece of luck, and one who didn't argue at the price of the room, a blessing. Mrs. Hall promised to show herself worthy of his stay. While the bacon cooked, she returned to the visitor's room with a tablecloth, plates, and glasses. Although the fire raged on, she was surprised to see the man still dressed in wet clothes. He stood with his back to her, staring out the window. His hands were clasped behind him, and he seemed lost in thought. "Can I take your coat and hat, sir?" "I'll get them dry in the kitchen," Mrs. Hall said. "No," he said without turning around. He glanced over his shoulder. "I prefer to keep them on." Only then did Mrs. Hall notice that he wore blue glasses that covered most of his face. His coat collar was turned up and covered his neck. "Very well," said Mrs. Hall. "As you wish. In a bit, the room will be warmer." Hearing no reply, Mrs. Hall left the room. Minutes later, she returned with bacon and eggs. "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," said the man without looking at her. Mrs. Hall would have liked to ask his name, but he was short with her. A man with no manners, she thought. When Mrs. Hall returned to the kitchen, she heard a ching, ching, chink. It was Milly, her helper, stirring the mustard. "Milly," Mrs. Hall gasped. "How could I forget the mustard? Surely he will be looking for the mustard jar." She quickly filled the mustard pot and carried it upstairs. Mrs. Hall knocked and opened the door. The visitor moved quickly, so quickly that she only got a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the desk. It was as if he were picking something up off the floor. She placed the mustard jar on the table and noticed the overcoat and hat on a chair in front of the fire. She reached for them. "I suppose I can take this to dry in the kitchen?" "Leave the hat," said a muffled voice. When she looked, he was still crouched behind the desk, but had raised his hand to speak. Mrs. Hall was too surprised to speak. The man was holding a white napkin over the bottom portion of his face. It covered his jaw and mouth, but that's not what startled her. It was the fact that his forehead above his glasses was covered by a white bandage. Another bandage covered his ears. Another scrap of his face, except his pink nose, showed. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with a high black collar turned up about his neck. His thick black hair, escaping between the crossed bandages, projected in curious curls. Mrs. Hall wasn't prepared to see such an odd sight. The man repeated through the napkin, "Leave the hat." Her nerve started to recover. She placed the hat by the fire. "I didn't know, sir," she began. "That..." She paused, a bit embarrassed. "Thank you," he said quickly. He glanced from her to the door and at her again. "I'll have them nicely dried," she assured him. As she scooted out of the room, she took one last look at the blue goggles and the white bandages before closing the door. The visitor sat listening to her retreating feet. Finally, he lowered his napkin and resumed eating. Mrs. Hall returned to the kitchen. Millie, that poor man, he said, an accident of some sort, maybe operation. His bandages scared me. Mrs. Hall unfolded his coat and set it by the fire. Those goggles! And holding that napkin over his mouth. How odd. Perhaps his mouth was hurt too. She thought of the strange man all evening. When she returned to his room to get the dishes, he was sitting in the corner with his back to the window. I have some luggage at the station. Can it be brought here now? He asked. Tomorrow, sir. No one can fetch it until then. The ropes are steep and accidents happen. Men have been killed in such weather. The morning light is better. He started to protest. You wouldn't want a man to get hurt now, would you? She asked. If you did, it could take him a long time to recover, don't you agree, sir? She continued on, hoping he'll take the bait. My nephew got hurt and had to have some operations. Did he? Said the stranger, sounding amused. Yes, he did. He had many bandages that needed caring for. Sir, if I may be so bold as to ask, he cut her off. Get me some matches. My pipe is out. Mrs. Hall blushed, annoyed. How could he ask for matches when I'm telling him about my nephew? Mrs. Hall left the room and returned to the kitchen. Once or twice she heard him get up and tend to the fire. She often spoke to himself, but she couldn't make out the words. What a strange visitor, she thought. What a strange visitor indeed.